All right, hello, and welcome to this online lecture on some philosophical issues in predicate logic. This is again a video intended for my HUP 112 class, Logic and Philosophy, at LaGuardia Community College. So in this lecture, I just want to introduce some very interesting philosophical issues that arise in the discussion of predicate logic. And most of these issues come up from Russell's discussion in Logical Atomism and lectures on Logical Atomism. Although some of the stuff we'll be talking about traces back to Immanuel Kant and so forth. So this is kind of just a general overview, not meant to be incredibly technically precise, but a way to get the discussion started online. So predicate logic, as you know by now, takes our truth functional connectives, which we have from propositional logic, and we just import those. So we have negation, we have disjunction, we have conjunction, and we have material implication. And then I don't show it here, but we also have material equivalence, or the biconditional. Now we add to that letters for predicates, which we use capital letters to stand for. And we also add to that constants, which we use lowercase letters to stand for, as well as variable terms, which we reserve the terms x, y, and z for variable terms. And then we also add quantifiers. So quantifiers, familiar from our discussions about categorical logic, quantifiers tell you how many of something that there are. So we have the all quantifier, which tells us that for all of these things that they're a certain way, and the existence quantifier, which says basically there is at least one of these things which is this way. And so part of what I want to talk about is involves what we should think about philosophically about these various components of our logic. So let's start with Russell's logical atomism, and again, this is a very brief overview. So here's a picture of my dog, Frankie, and Frankie has some properties. So she has the property of being brown, and she has the property of being a dog. And so this just seems to be a metaphysical fact about reality, that there are objects with properties. And this is mirrored in our logical structure by the fact that we have predicates, which are supposed to stand for or express properties, and consonants, which pick out individuals. So that what we see here on this view is a correspondence between the way we symbolize or think about or talk about reality and the very structure of reality itself. So that Russell thinks that what the world is made out of, in some sense, are properties and individuals which have those properties. An individual defined as something which doesn't depend on something else for its existence, can exist on its own. A property depends on something else for its existence. Brown depends on there being a dog or something which is brown. Now, the quantified statements, which we talked about briefly just a second ago, do not mention or refer to or pick out any individual objects. And so that's a very different kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a second. So here's a fact. Frankie is a brown dog. And we would symbolize that in our predicate logic as follows, using D to stand for is a dog and B to stand for is brown. Then we have Frankie is a dog and Frankie is brown. Now notice that this is something which Russell calls a proposition. It expresses a proposition. So propositions are things that can be true or false, and this sentence that we've written here can be evaluated as being true or false. And the way we do that is by, according to Russell in this picture, is by looking for the corresponding fact. So this sentence, this proposition, tells us that we should find a fact, the fact that Frankie is a dog and the fact that Frankie is brown. And so we could go and check and see, and it turns out that if there is a corresponding fact, then the sentence is true, and if there is no corresponding fact, then the proposition is false. Now you might say, okay, well, what is this fact that the thing corresponds to? Is it just Frankie herself? And Russell says no, it can't be Frankie herself, because what the fact is a relationship between Frankie and the property of being a dog, or the property of being brown. So it's more than just the dog itself. The dog is part of the relationship, so Frankie is part of this relationship. But there's also this other thing, the property of being a dog, which Russell thinks of as a universal. Many things can have it. Frankie's just one instance of that. So that's a very interesting idea, that facts are not the same as the material object, that they're somehow over and above, and that's very interesting. Okay, so what about the sentence Frankie exists? How would you symbolize that? Well, on the front of it, it looks like this is a fact. There's a fact of Frankie's existing, and it looks like this sentence is a subject-predicate sentence, just like the others, and it looks like there's an individual constant here, Frankie, and there looks like there's a property, the property of Frankie existing, and so it looks like we would symbolize that as EF, or Frankie exists. So that would be the natural way to do it, and Russell argues that this is not the right way to do it. So let's back up a little bit. We can look at something which is historically been known as the puzzle of non-existence. This is a way of bringing out this thing that Russell thinks is important. So suppose that you say, okay, well, so how do we treat the sentence Santa Claus doesn't exist? Well, if we're thinking of existence in the same way we just did, so there's an individual constant, S, and there's a property, the property of existing, and we're saying that S doesn't have that property. Now, we can notice right off the bat that there's something weird about this, that when we say that Santa doesn't exist, it seems like we're somehow tacitly committing ourselves to the fact that Santa does exist. Why? Well, we can bring that out by asking the question, what does the constant stand for? Remember, in our predicate logic, constants are supposed to just sort of be directly referring things that pick out a particular individual object, a particular thing which can exist on its own. Well, if Santa doesn't exist, then which thing is this picking out? So it looks like in order to even say that Santa doesn't exist, Santa has to exist. And that's a very puzzling puzzle. In the history of philosophy, this led some people to think that, well, these things do exist in some abstract way, just not in a concrete way. So we can discuss that if you want to. Now, here's another puzzle about this, because it looks like if you take this view seriously, it looks like, okay, so there's this object, Santa Claus. That's the thing picked out by S, and that thing can either exist or not exist. So that sounds very strange. What does it mean to say that that thing doesn't exist? It's a very weird and wonderful problem that we've developed here, that we're saying there's this object that lacks the property of existing. So we've clearly gotten ourselves into some kind of trouble, because predicates, by their nature, express properties which some objects have and other objects lack. So we're just straightforwardly committed to this view that there are some objects which lack existence, but if they're objects, then they exist. So how do they lack? So okay, so we're going around in a circle here. As a related worry, Russell says, look, also this is true of every object that is in existence, that it's true that it has the property of existing. And if you have a property which applies to everything, then what kind of property are you talking about? So Russell thinks that these kinds of puzzles illustrate the problem with thinking of existence as a predicate. And notice that's why when we introduce existence into our logic, our modern predicate logic, we treat existence as a quantifier, not as a predicate. And when you treat existence as a quantifier, you get a very different result. So take our sentence again, Santa doesn't exist. If we treat that as a quantificational statement, then we're going to end up saying it's not the case that there exists an X such that X is Santa Claus. Where the S here, the capital S, stands for a predicate. It expresses a property, the property that we would say is something like correctly being described as Santa Claus, lives in the North Pole, delivers gifts to children, that kind of thing. So now notice that in this logical proposition here, no individual entity is picked out. All that it says is that for everything that exists, it's not the case that that thing is correctly described as Santa Claus. So if you apply the change of quantifier rule, this sentence is really just equivalent to saying everything is not Santa Claus, right? There's nothing that's Santa Claus. So there are no Santa Clauses in the world. Just means that if you do a total inventory on the things which exist in the world, none of them will be Santa Claus. And that sentence can come out to be perfectly true, and we didn't have to refer to or pick out some mysterious entity in order to do it. So treating existence as a quantifier has this very nice result. Now, of course, it comes with a trade-off, though, because we cannot assert of any individual object that it exists. We cannot say this table exists, unless all that we mean is that there exists an object which is a table. And that will be true of this object. And so Russell ends up saying that existence is not a property of objects, but a property of this propositional functional thing up here. And all that it means is that it's sometimes true. So in order to avoid the puzzle of non-existence, then you're pushed to treating existence as a quantifier rather than a predicate. The other thing which comes out of this is that Santa Claus, which we took to be a name, a constant, which refers to or picks out some individual object, it actually turns out to be a description. The description roughly being the thing which wears red suits, live at the North Pole, delivers gifts to children on Christmas Eve, eats the cookies, etc., etc. There's this long description thing, and that's what S stands for there. And notice no object was talked about specifically. You're just saying the thing which is this way. There is no thing which is this way. So you haven't picked out any particular object at all. And names turn out to be descriptions on Russell's view. Now, to complicate things a little bit, and I won't go into this too much because there's a lot of other stuff to talk about here, but Russell does think that there are what he calls logical names, like this or that, which don't get treated as disguised descriptions, but we'll talk about that shortly. So this just says, again, what I just said, these things do not refer, they are not picking out individual objects. So we can look at another application of this, which comes from Russell's theory of definite descriptions. So he says, look, we can solve another puzzle here. So consider this following sentence: the King of America is tall. Intuitively speaking, that sentence is false. And so if we wanted to capture that, it looks like a subject-predicate sentence. The subject here is the King of America, and the predicate is being tall. And so if we symbolize that as TK, then its negation doesn't seem to be false, because that would be to say that it's not the case that the King of America is tall. So in first order logic, we define a negation as we define a sentence as being false, being equivalent to its negation being true. So if the King of America is tall turns out to be false, then its negation should be true. But if we do things this way, the negation of that sentence looks like It's not the case that the King of America is tall. And that also seems equally false because there is no King of America. So what Russell did, so that also seems like it's false. And so this seems to violate some basic rule of logic that one of these two sentences has to be true, a sentence and its negation. Okay, so Russell says, well, look, we can treat this in a different way. So instead of thinking as K as a constant, as something which refers to or picks out an object, we think of it as a description. The thing which is correctly described as ruling America, being of royal lineage, blah, 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 the various things which we would describe as being a king. So you say, all right, if we wanted to say that the King of America is tall, we would say it this way. There exists an X such that X is the King of America and X is tall. And now I'm leaving out some complications here. To be quite honest, Russell would argue that we would have to include some kind of uniqueness description in there. So we'd have to say the one and only King of America is tall, and I've left that out just because it's easier to write without doing that. We could put it in there if we wanted to, but it's not really necessary for the points that are being made. Okay, so, but for technical completeness, you should be aware of it. All right, so here then, this is the way we would symbolize the King of America is tall. And now we see that we can make it false, not by negating the is tall part, but by negating the existence claim itself. And so that's the difference between the second translation there and the third one. So the second line here says it is not the case that there exists an X such that X is the King of America and X is tall. The last line there says there exists an X such that X is King of America and X is not tall. That's a translation of the sentence, the third sentence on the screen there, the King of America is not tall. So that's how you would translate that sentence, and it's perfectly fine that those two sentences turn out to be false. So the sentence there exists an X such that KX and TX, that turns out to be false, and it's also false that there exists an X such that KX and not TX, and that's false because of this third way of making it false. Those two sentences are both false because there doesn't exist an X such that KX and TX. So that we've now seen a way out of this very puzzling situation, and it all derives from treating existence as a quantifier combined with the idea that some things which look like constants really turn out to be descriptions and they aren't referring terms at all. Okay, so let's go ahead then and turn to the final issue here, which is applying these kinds of ideas to one very famous argument in the philosophy of religion, which is the ontological argument for God's existence. So here's a version of it that's closer to the version that Descartes gives than the version that you get from St. Anselm, but it's just easier to talk about it in this way. So premise 1 says God is a perfect being. Premise 2 says if God didn't exist, then he wouldn't be perfect, right? He would be lacking something. Perfection means you don't lack anything. So the conclusion is therefore God exists. So if we were to treat existence as a predicate, then we would symbolize the argument as follows. So the first premise says that God has a certain property, the property of being a perfect being. The second premise says if God didn't exist, so we have E here as a predicate, then it wouldn't be the case that God has that property. And the conclusion is God exists, where E here is a predicate, the existence predicate. And we can see that this is just a version of modus tollens. So if we write the argument this way, the argument is perfectly valid. So in order to invalidate this argument, it looks like we would have to abandon the idea that existence is a predicate. And this is something that Kant is, I think, the first in the history of philosophy to point out, that this ontological argument is guilty of treating existence as a property that improves an object. Kant kind of makes fun of this idea. He says, look, if I'm thinking of $100 and then suddenly I get 100 actual dollars, the fact that the 100 actual dollars exists and the other ones that I thought about didn't doesn't make the ones in my hand more valuable. It doesn't make them worth more money. It's still worth $100 in my hand, and it was worth $100 in my thought. The only difference is that in one case there is some actual money, and in the other case there is not. So the hope is, well, if we treat existence as a quantifier, then this argument turns out to be invalid. Now, one interesting line of response to this is to try to recast the argument in terms of quantification. So here's one attempt to do that. So here we treat the first premise the same way, G, P, or God is perfect, a perfect being. The second premise says, if it isn't the case that there exists an X such that X equals G, then it's not the case that G is perfect, and the conclusion is that there exists an X such that X equals G. So here what we've done is we've taken to heart this idea that existence is a quantifier, and we've simply used it, we've used the identity here, and we've said, look, there exists an object which is God. If there doesn't, then God isn't perfect, and you get the same conclusion. There's an object which is God. So it looks like this idea that existence is a quantifier isn't really what's wrong with the argument. And this is a way of kind of making a criticism of this kind of logic, which originates with Quine, although Quine does not present it in terms of the ontological argument. The basic problem, says Quine, is that we've allowed individual constants into our logic, and just by having it there, it assumes that there is an object which it refers to. So by introducing G to stand for God, we now have this being around. And so if that's the case, then it just follows logically that that thing exists. So the very fact that you have a constant is already assuming that the thing exists. And so we ought not to allow individual constants, because if we really want to be careful that we're not assuming that these things exist, and then deriving the fact that they exist from that assumption, then we've got to get rid of all of our constants. This is kind of a radical position in logic, to deny that there are individual constants, because it seems really common sense that we can take a letter and say, let this stand for Socrates, the man himself, and then reason about it. But Quine's argument is this is a problem, because then if it works, then we can prove that God exists here. So how would this argument look if we took this to heart? Well, if you don't allow constants, well, then you can't assign G to some being. So we would have to write the first premise here different. It says God is a perfect being. We could interpret that as the claim that for all x, if x is God, then x is perfect. Where the big G here is a predicate, which says basically that x is correctly described as being God. So God is, omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. So all those things, it can be described in terms of those. Now, what about the second premise? If God didn't exist, then he wouldn't be perfect. Well, we could write that as follows. If there didn't exist an x such that x was God, then there wouldn't exist an x such that x is perfect. That's a way of capturing what's going on up there. These existence claims have to be made quantificationally. We can't use individual constants when we're making existence claims. That's the lesson from before. So now from that, we can use De Morgan's rule and get rid of the conditional statement there, and basically see what the sentence is really telling us is that either God exists or there isn't a perfect being. And if we wanted to get rid of that and really bring this out further, we could see that really what's going on here is that what we're being told is that either God exists or everything is imperfect. So now if we knew that everything was imperfect, we could conclude that God exists. If we knew that God didn't exist, we can conclude that everything was imperfect. But of course now we can see that these are further facts that we don't know. We don't know if everything's imperfect. Because that very question resides on finding out whether there's a perfect being or not. You can diagnose what is wrong with the ontological argument, but only if you get... It's not enough to say existence is a quantifier. You have to also get rid of individual constants in your logic. And just as a final point, we can look at the first premise there. The first premise is also just telling us, look, everything is either not God or perfect, and that'll be true of every object. It's true of me, I'm not God. It's true of you, you're not God. It's true of this computer, the computer's not God. It's true of the sun's not God. Now, if we knew that there were no perfect being, so if we knew that it was the case that there was no perfect being, then we can conclude that there was no being which was God, but we don't know that. And so again, what this shows is that if you get rid of these constants, then you can block the ontological argument. Existence as a quantifier, though widely held to do the job, doesn't really do the job unless you disallow people assigning constants. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward towards some interesting discussion arising from these issues.